The whole class laughed when Jamal solved the problem, not because he was wrong, but because his teacher said a boy like him could never be that smart. But what no one knew was that the equations he erased in shame would shake the scientific world, and when the truth finally came out, the same people who mocked him would be forced to face something they couldn't erase. What happens when genius refuses to stay silent? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The fluorescent lights in room 2114 hummed faintly, flickering just enough to make the morning feel heavier than it already was. The desks were etched with years of initials and crude drawings, the kind of graffiti that outlasted generations of students. It was Tuesday, a day that carried no particular meaning for most. But for Jamal Carter, 17 and brimming with restless energy, it was a day he could no longer keep silent. He sat in the middle row, hunched over a notebook that looked like it had lived several lives. Its pages overflowed with numbers, sketches, and half-finished equations written in his sharp, determined handwriting, while others around him scrolled their phones under desks or whispered about weekend plans. Jamal's mind churned. He wasn't daydreaming. He was calculating, dissecting, imagining. Last night, he had barely slept, convinced he had uncovered something significant, a new way to map out unpredictable outcomes through sequences of equations. It wasn't just theory to him, it was possibility, a door swinging open in a world that often kept them locked. In most classes, Jamal kept to himself. Being one of the few black students in advanced math had taught him an unspoken survival rule: speak only when necessary, and never stand out more than required. Every time he had tried, his words had been met with either suspicion or dismissal. But today something inside him fought harder than fear. Maybe it was exhaustion from silence. Maybe it was the irritation of hearing Mr. Whitmore lecture about proofs he had already mastered. Or maybe it was his mother's voice in the back of his head, urging him to believe in his gift. Whatever it was, when Whitmore asked for a volunteer to solve a problem on the board, Jamal's hand rose. The room shifted. Heads turned toward him. Some eyebrows arched. Some lips curled into quiet smirks. Even Whitmore hesitated for half a second before nodding, his mouth tightening the way it did when he expected disappointment. Jamal stood, his palms damp against the surface of his notebook. For a moment he thought about just writing out the assigned problem like everyone else. But something in him refused. He walked to the board, chalk in hand, and opened his notebook. Instead of Whitmore's exercise, Jamal began writing the equations he had been working on all night. The chalk squeaked across the green surface as he drew lines, variables, and arcs of thought too advanced for the lesson plan. At first the classroom murmurs died down, replaced by a silence that felt heavier with each symbol he added. Even the usual troublemakers leaned forward, their smirks replaced by confusion and curiosity. Whitmore at his desk barely looked up at first, but when the whispering grew, he pushed himself to his feet and squinted at the board. Jamal's pulse quickened. This was the moment, his chance to be seen, truly seen. His teacher would recognize the logic, maybe even commend him for going beyond the lesson. For once the classroom wouldn't just laugh, or dismiss. Instead, Whitmore let out a laugh of his own, a sharp, humorless sound that sliced through the fragile hope hanging in the room. "Mr. Carter," Whitmore said loudly, stepping closer, "what exactly is this circus act? Some graffiti you mistook for mathematics?" The silence broke, giving way to laughter. It started with a few chuckles but spread quickly, bouncing off the walls until Jamal felt it pressing in from every direction. It wasn't the theory they were mocking. It was him. He could hear it in the tone, feel it in the eyes on him. Whitmore tapped the board with his pointer, shaking his head. "This is what happens when ambition gets ahead of foundation. You'd do better to stick with the basics before trying to play Einstein." The word Einstein came out not as admiration but as insult, coated with sarcasm. And then came the word that pierced deeper than all the others. "Noise," Whitmore declared, waving his hand at the board. "Nothing but noise." The laughter swelled again, feeding on Jamal's silence. His throat tightened, his fingers went numb around the chalk. He wanted to explain, to lay out the structure, to prove this wasn't noise but possibility. Yet every instinct told him it was pointless. Challenging Whitmore wouldn't bring recognition. It would bring punishment. Especially here. Especially for him. He turned back to the board, eyes blurring with shame, and began to erase. Each stroke felt like erasing himself, his nights of work, his belief that maybe, just maybe, He had something worth sharing. The chalk dust clung to his fingertips as the equations vanished, piece by piece, swallowed by the green surface, until nothing remained but faint white smears. Whitmore returned to his desk, muttering something about wasted time. The students leaned back in their chairs, their laughter dissolving into new conversations, as though nothing had happened. For them it was a momentary joke, a flicker of entertainment. For Jamal it was devastation, disguised as routine. He dropped the eraser onto the tray, the sound louder than it should have been, and stepped back. His chest ached with humiliation. His notebook suddenly felt like a burden in his hands. He promised himself quietly, bitterly, that he would never again expose his ideas in this room. If brilliance only invited ridicule, then better to hide it away. But at the back of the room, not everyone was laughing. Leah Turner sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the board before Jamal erased it. She wasn't one of the loud ones. Never had been. She noticed things others missed, and what she had seen in those lines of chalk didn't look like noise. It looked like something deliberate, something alive. Her curiosity burned as the rest of the class drowned in laughter. When Jamal turned back to erase, Leah reached down, slipping her phone into her lap. Angling it carefully, she snapped a photo, just before the last traces of chalk disappeared. Her heart raced, not from fear but from instinct. Something told her this wasn't the end of what she had seen. Jamal, head low, never noticed. He walked back to his seat, carrying silence heavier than any book, convinced the moment had crushed his chance forever. But Leah's photo had captured something he could not erase. Lincoln Heights wasn't the kind of neighborhood that celebrated dreams. The houses leaned tiredly against each other, their porches sagging, paint peeling, windows patched with tape. Sirens were more common than applause here. Yet inside one of those weathered homes, at the end of a narrow street, there was a light always left on for him, a reminder that no matter how loud the world's doubts grew, someone believed. When Jamal opened the door, the smell of fried chicken and collard greens filled the small living room. His mother, Denise Carter, stood at the stove, her hair wrapped in a scarf, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. 2 jobs kept her on her feet most hours of the day, but she always found time to cook when she could. To her, feeding Jamal was more than nourishment. It was a shield against a world that too often tried to strip boys like him of their worth. "You're late," she said without turning, her voice warm but edged with concern. "Had to stay after for math," Jamal muttered, dropping his backpack onto the couch. He tried to keep his tone flat, neutral. He didn't want her to hear the crack in it. Denise turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes lingered on him, sharp and searching, the way only a mother's eyes could. She saw the slump in his shoulders, the heaviness in his step. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Jamal hesitated. He wanted to say nothing, to keep it buried, but her gaze was relentless. He sank into the chair by the table, staring at his hands. "I tried to show something I was working on. On the board." Denise tilted her head, waiting. The teacher laughed. Everybody laughed. Said it was noise. His voice cracked at the last word, and he hated how small it sounded. Denise crossed the room, kneeling beside him. She lifted his chin with her fingers, forcing his eyes to meet hers. Her own eyes glistened, not with pity but with fire. "Baby, don't you ever let someone who doesn't understand your mind tell you it's noise," she said firmly. They laughed at every genius before the world caught up. They mocked them because they couldn't see. "That's not your fault. That's theirs." Jamal blinked, his throat tight. He wanted to believe her, but the memory of laughter still pressed hard. Denise stood, pressing a kiss to the top of his head before returning to the stove. "Your gift is real, Jamal. I've seen it since you were little. The way you'd take apart radios just to see how they worked. The way you'd cover walls with numbers. Don't you let that man or anyone else erase what God put in you." Dinner was quiet after that, the hum of the fridge filling the space between clinks of forks against plates. Jamal chewed slowly, his mind still circling the classroom. Every time he replayed the scene, he felt the sting again, but Denise's words lingered too, tugging at him like a lifeline. Later that night, Jamal sat at the small desk in his room. His notebook lay open, the equations staring back at him, like old friends waiting to be rescued. For a long time, he just stared, hesitant to pick up his pencil. What if Whitmore was right? What if it was noise? Then, almost defiantly, he began writing again. Line after line, number after number. His hand moved faster than his doubt could catch up. He didn't stop until the page was filled, And even then, he kept going, scribbling into the margins, his mind alight with determination. From the hallway, Denise peeked in. She didn't say anything. She just watched him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. The sight of him bent over his work, stubbornly pushing forward, gave her strength she didn't know she had left. The next morning, the weight of yesterday hadn't fully lifted. But Jamal walked with a little more steadiness. He tucked his notebook into his backpack, like carrying a secret the world wasn't ready for. At school, the stares lingered. Whispers of yesterday still floated in the halls, but he kept his head down, repeating his mother's words in his mind like armor. They laughed at every genius before the world caught up. What Jamal didn't know was that something unexpected was already in motion. That evening when he returned home, Denise handed him a thin envelope that had arrived in the mail. The return address wasn't familiar. Some regional science committee, in Boston. Jamal frowned, confused. He hadn't applied to anything, hadn't sent his work anywhere beyond the classroom board. Open it, Denise urged, setting down the stack of bills she'd been sorting. Jamal tore the envelope carefully, pulling out a neatly folded letter. His eyes scanned the words, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. It was an invitation. The committee had heard of a promising mathematical submission, attached with a photo of his equations, and wanted to consider it for their annual regional science fair. Jamal froze, the paper trembling in his hands. He hadn't submitted anything. He hadn't told anyone. His gaze darted to the last line, where the photo was referenced, a photo of the equations he thought he had erased forever. Jamal swallowed hard, the realization hitting him like a thunderclap. Someone had seen. Someone had kept a record. Jamal receives a letter, not from the school, but from a science fair committee he never applied to, with proof that his erased equations had already escaped the classroom. The letter sat on Jamal's desk like a puzzle piece that didn't belong. He had read it at least 5 times since it arrived, tracing every line, every carefully typed word. A science fair committee in Boston wanted to evaluate his equations he had never sent them. The idea should have thrilled him, should have been validation. Instead, it left him unsettled. He hadn't chosen to share his work, and yet it had already slipped beyond his control. Denise, watching from the kitchen, had tried to comfort him. Baby, maybe this is the door you've been waiting for. Maybe God's just showing you the world is bigger than that classroom. Jamal wanted to believe her, but a shadow of dread followed him into school the next morning. He carried the letter in his bag like contraband, nervous that somehow, someone already knew. By mid-morning, a slip appeared on his desk during algebra, passed silently by a hall monitor. Report to the principal's office. The room seemed to tilt. Students snickered, some whispering like they already knew the reason. Jamal's throat went dry as he gathered his things and walked out, feeling every pair of eyes drilling into his back. Principal Raymond's office smelled of polished wood and old carpet. Framed certificates lined the walls, alongside photos of sports teams holding trophies. Jamal noticed how none of those photos showed kids who looked like him at the center. Sit down, Jamal, Raymond said, gesturing to the stiff leather chair across from his desk. His tone wasn't hostile, but it carried that edge of condescension Jamal knew all too well. Jamal sat, his palms sweaty against his jeans. The principal folded his hands. Now I've heard some chatter about what went on in Mr. Whitmore's class this week. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. And I've also seen something curious. This. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printed copy of the letter from Boston. Jamal's stomach dropped. How did you? We were contacted, Raymond interrupted smoothly. They wanted to verify your eligibility before extending a formal invitation. But let's be clear, Jamal. Opportunities like this aren't meant for every student. Certainly not for someone still struggling to keep focus in the classroom. Jamal stiffened. I'm not struggling. Raymond raised a hand, silencing him. You're bright, no doubt about that. But sometimes, young men like you get distracted. You start chasing things that sound impressive but aren't realistic. And then when it all falls apart, it's your family and your community who suffer. The words stung, sharp and deliberate. Young men like you. Jamal knew exactly what he meant. You should think carefully about where to place your energy, Raymond continued. I've seen students throw away real opportunities, sports scholarships, vocational training, chasing fantasies, and they end up with nothing. You don't want to be that kid, do you? Jamal's jaw tightened. With respect, sir. This isn't a fantasy. The equation. Raymond cut him off again, his smile thin. Equations won't pay the bills, Jamal. Reality will. Focus on what's attainable. Leave the rest to people who are better suited. The silence that followed burned in Jamal's ears. He sat there staring at the principal's smug calmness, feeling smaller with each passing second. The message was clear. It wasn't about whether his work had merit. It was about who he was. Finally, Raymond leaned back, as though the matter were settled. I'll politely decline on your behalf. It's best this way. No need to get your hopes tangled in things beyond your reach. Jamal stood slowly, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't trust his voice enough to speak. He just nodded once, stiffly, and walked out. The hallway felt different as he stepped back into it. Longer, colder. Students passed him without noticing the storm building inside him. He reached his locker, opened it and shoved his bag inside with more force than necessary. His notebook slid forward, the pages crinkling from where he had pressed too hard the night before. He touched the worn cover, torn between despair and defiance. They wanted him to stay quiet, invisible, manageable, just like in the classroom, just like always. But if he stayed silent, his ideas would die in that notebook. That evening, back in his room, Jamal sat staring at his laptop. The Boston letter lay beside him, its edges curled from being handled so many times. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Don't let anyone erase what God put in you. He opened the laptop, his hands trembling slightly as he typed. He searched for journals, mathematics, science, anywhere his work might be seen without gatekeepers like Whitmore or Raymond deciding its worth. Finally, he found one, a modest online math journal that welcomed independent submissions. He read through the guidelines twice, his pulse racing. But then the doubt returned. What if they laughed, just like Whitmore? What if submitting exposed him to more humiliation? He stared at the submission box, frozen. Then, a thought struck him. What if they didn't know it was him? What if the name was different, unrecognizable, unlinked to the boy who had been mocked at the chalkboard? Slowly, carefully, Jamal typed out a pseudonym, J.A. Miles, a name no one at Lincoln High would connect to him. He uploaded his manuscript, double-checking every equation, every line, every word. His heart pounded as he hit submit. For a moment he felt lighter, as though the act itself had pulled him beyond the walls built around him. He leaned back, exhaling shakily. Outside his window the night was quiet, but inside him everything buzzed with possibility. Jamal didn't know what would come of it, or if anything would come at all. But he knew this. He could no longer wait for permission. Jamal decides to secretly submit his theory manuscript to an online math journal, under a fake name. The glow of Jamal's laptop was the only light in his room that night. After hitting submit, he had sat in silence, staring at the blank screen as if waiting for something immediate to happen. But nothing did. No flashing banners, no emails of instant recognition, just silence. The next day passed much the same. School was no kinder. Whispers trailed him in the hallway, remnants of Whitmore's cruel dismissal. Even Leah, the quiet classmate who had snapped the photo, kept her distance, as if unsure whether speaking to him would put her in the same crosshairs. Jamal kept his notebook close, but he didn't dare open it in class again. 3 nights later, something shifted. While scrolling through his phone, Jamal stumbled across a math forum he occasionally lurked in, a place where graduate students and professors batted theories back and forth like seasoned athletes tossing a ball. Usually he just read quietly, marveling at how sharp their minds were, how fast they solved complex puzzles. But tonight a post pinned at the top froze him in place. It was his equations. He blinked, leaning closer to the screen. The thread was already sprawling, dozens of comments deep. The post title read, "Curious submission to the journal. Who is J.A. Miles?" His heart slammed against his ribs. They were talking about him. He clicked, and the words poured in. This can't be from an amateur. The structure is too advanced. If genuine, it could have applications in predictive modeling. But I don't buy that it's original. I ran the numbers. There's something here. This isn't random. Comment after comment debated the work. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others picked apart the math with brutal scrutiny, and a few defended it passionately. For the first time, Jamal wasn't invisible. His ideas weren't dismissed with a smirk. They were being fought over. He scrolled faster, his pulse racing. Professors with university titles attached to their usernames argued late into the night. Words like groundbreaking and impossible collided on the screen. It was chaos, But to Jamal, it felt like electricity. And then, a twist he hadn't expected. Someone suspected the truth. One user wrote, "The journal says this submission came from an independent. That's laughable. No high schooler could write this. This smells like plagiarism." The thread exploded. Accusations flew. Demands for the identity of J.A. Miles surfaced again and again. Some said the work was stolen from a professor. Others argued it must have come from a collective disguised as one name. Jamal's stomach tightened. He had feared humiliation, but this was worse. They thought his brilliance was theft. The following day, the debate spilled beyond the forum. A small blog covering academic news published a piece titled, "The Mystery of J.A. Miles, Prodigy or Fraud." The article didn't name him, but it spread the fire wider. Twitter threads began to speculate. Graduate students dissected screenshots of his equations like they were treasure maps. Jamal tried to keep it secret, but the noise was everywhere. By the time he sat down for dinner that night, even Denise noticed the way he clutched his phone like a lifeline. "What's going on with you?" she asked, setting down a plate in front of him. Jamal hesitated, then pushed the phone toward her. The forum glowed on the screen, the thread still alive with arguments. She squinted, reading for a moment before glancing back at him. "This is yours?" He nodded, his chest heavy. "I submitted under another name. They're actually talking about it. Some think it's real. Some think I stole it." Denise stared at him, a mixture of awe and fury in her eyes. "Baby, they always think we stole it when it comes from us. They can't stand the idea that brilliance can come out of a boy from Lincoln Heights. That's their blindness, not yours." Her words steadied him, but the storm online only grew. By the end of the week, the journal itself released a statement acknowledging the submission's authenticity. They didn't reveal his identity, but confirmed the work wasn't plagiarized from any existing published source. That only deepened the frenzy. If it wasn't stolen, then who could possibly have written it? That night, Jamal checked his email before bed. His inbox pulsed with a new message from the editorial board of the journal. His breath caught as he opened it. The email was short, direct. "One of our external reviewers has requested the author's identity. They believe the submission is fraudulent. If you do not reveal who you are, they are threatening to go public with claims of academic misconduct. Please advise." Jamal's hands shook so violently, he nearly dropped the laptop. He read the words again, each one sharper than the last. A professor, an established voice, was ready to tear him apart, unless he stepped into the light. The thought of revealing himself made his chest tighten. What would happen if his classmates, Whitmore, Principal Raymond, if the whole school found out he was J.A. Miles? Would they laugh louder? Would they accuse him of lying, of making it all up? And yet, hiding felt equally dangerous. If he stayed silent, the professor's accusations could smear his name before it was even known. Denise, sensing his panic, came to his side. "What is it?" He turned the laptop toward her. She read the email slowly, her jaw tightening. "They're trying to scare you," she said softly, but firmly. "They want you to fold. They want you to believe you don't belong. But Jamal, if you keep hiding, they'll write your story for you." Jamal sat back, his mind spinning. He had thought submitting under a false name would protect him. Now it was the very thing threatening to destroy him. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe, but the questions wouldn't stop. Should he reveal himself? Should he trust the journal? Or was there another way to fight back? One professor emails the journal, demanding to know who authored the work, and threatens to expose fraud if the name isn't revealed. The email from the journal still weighed on Jamal's mind the next morning. He had barely slept, replaying the words over and over. A professor, someone who had devoted their life to mathematics, was threatening to call him a fraud unless he revealed himself. His hands shook every time he thought about it. But he had no time to figure out his response before the storm hit. By third period, whispers filled the hallway again. This time, they weren't about Whitmore's cruel laughter. They were about him. Jamal noticed the stares first, longer, sharper, carrying something different than usual: mockery. Some students smirked knowingly, others avoided his eyes altogether. Then in chemistry, it happened. A boy 2 seats over shoved his phone in Jamal's direction. The screen lit with a photo. The photo. Jamal froze. There it was, the chalkboard filled with his equations, the very ones he had erased under humiliation. And underneath the photo, a caption: "Meet J.A. Miles, the fraud from Lincoln High." His blood ran cold. The picture had spread across social media, reposted by accounts that thrived on scandal. The connection was obvious now. The anonymous submission to the journal, and the boy mocked in class. He was no longer invisible. He was By lunch the entire school buzzed. Screens glowed across cafeteria tables with the same post. Some students laughed, calling him a wannabe genius. Others whispered words he knew too well: cheater, liar, fraud. A few even looked impressed, but their admiration was drowned beneath the louder voices of ridicule. Whitmore's smirk in the teacher's lounge was sharper than usual. That afternoon, Jamal was summoned again. This time not to Principal Raymond's office, but to the conference room where the school board occasionally gathered. Denise sat there already, her work uniform still creased, her face tight with worry. She clutched her purse like it was armor. Principal Raymond sat at the head of the long table, flanked by two board members Jamal barely recognized. Their faces were unreadable, but their tone carried the same weight he had felt in Raymond's office days before: suspicion disguised as professionalism. "Mr. Carter," one board member began, "there's been significant attention regarding some mathematical work allegedly linked to you. A photo from your classroom surfaced online. We need to address this directly." Denise leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Allegedly linked? That's my son's work. He's been writing those numbers since he was a boy."
Raymond cleared his throat, his gaze settling on Jamal. "The problem, Mrs. Carter, is credibility. These equations, if legitimate, are far beyond high school level, which raises questions about where they really came from."
Jamal's fists clenched under the table. "They came from me." The board members exchanged glances, as though his words only proved their point. "Son," the second board member said, his tone clipped, "we've had incidents before of students plagiarizing advanced work for attention, claiming ownership of theories beyond their comprehension. It's not unheard of." Denise slammed her hand against the table. "You think my son is stealing? You think a boy from this neighborhood couldn't be brilliant without lying?" The room went quiet. Raymond's smile thinned. "No one is accusing outright, but the accusations are out there, and the school's reputation is at stake. Until this is clarified, we can't allow Mr. Carter to remain in class, as though nothing has happened." Jamal's chest tightened. "You're suspending me?" Raymond spread his hands, feigning regret. "Pending investigation." Denise's voice broke with fury. "You'd rather believe he stole it than admit he's gifted? Is that what this is?"
Neither board member answered. Their silence was worse than words.
It told Jamal everything. They didn't believe his mind could possibly create something extraordinary. To them, brilliance had an expected face, and his wasn't it. The decision was final. Jamal was suspended for 2 weeks. He was to stay home while the board evaluated whether his work was authentic or not. That night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, the suspension letter folded neatly in front of him like a verdict. Denise paced the floor, muttering about lawyers they couldn't afford, and the injustice of it all. "You've got to fight this," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't let them bury you." But Jamal just stared at the letter, numb. He had thought the online accusations were bad enough. Now his own school, the place meant to teach him, had branded him a liar. And yet, while his world collapsed inside the walls of Lincoln High, the outside world was stirring. The journal had quietly forwarded his manuscript to external reviewers. Professors scattered across the country, and some of them were impressed. Impressed enough to send invitation. 2 days into his suspension, Jamal opened his email and found 3 messages waiting. One was from a mathematics department in Chicago, another from a research symposium in New York, and the third from an international science committee he had only read about in passing. Each one wanted him to present. Each one assumed he was J.A. Miles. Jamal's breath caught as he read them. The very thing his school called plagiarism, the world beyond was calling brilliance. But he barely had time to process it before his phone buzzed with another notification. A new post had gone viral. This one wasn't from strangers online. It was from someone inside the school. A teacher, maybe, or a board member. It showed the suspension notice with Jamal's name circled in red. The caption read, "Lincoln High won't tolerate academic dishonesty." Denise stormed into his room moments later, holding her phone. "They're trying to destroy you before you even start." Her voice cracked, tears slipping free. "Baby, they don't want the world to see you for what you are. They'd rather call you a thief than admit they were wrong." Jamal sat on his bed, email invitations glowing on his laptop screen, the suspension notice glowing on hers. 2 realities collided in front of him. The world out there hungry for his mind, and the institution closest to him, trying to bury it. He closed his eyes, the weight crushing him from both sides. But deep down, something else flickered. If the school wanted to erase him, maybe the answer was to step beyond its reach entirely. Jamal is suspended just as invitations for academic conferences begin pouring in. The suspension letter still sat on the kitchen counter, its sharp edges curling at the corners from being handled too many times. Denise had read it until the words blurred, pacing the house like a caged animal, while Jamal sat at the table with his laptop glowing in front of him. On one side, his school called him a fraud. On the other, invitations to academic conferences filled his inbox. Two realities colliding. One suffocating, the other impossible. It was in that fragile middle ground during the second week of his suspension that the email arrived. Unlike the other invitations, this one didn't come from a generic committee or an assistant copying boilerplate text. It was direct, personal. Mr. Miles, my name is Dr. Elijah Brooks. I am a professor of applied mathematics at MIT. I reviewed your recent submission, and I have to be candid, your work shook me. Not only is it original, but it carries implications far beyond the journal's narrow scope. If you are truly the author, I would very much like to speak with you. Respectfully, Dr. Elijah Brooks. Jamal read it 3 times, then a 4th. His chest tightened as if the words themselves had weight. MIT. A place he had only ever heard about in documentaries and news stories about prodigies who lived on another planet entirely. And here was a professor from that world, reaching out to him. Denise hovered behind him, her eyes skimming the screen. She pressed a hand to her mouth, then whispered, "Baby. That's real. That's not just some conference. That's MIT. Jamal's voice cracked. What if he doesn't believe me when I say it's really mine? Denise's eyes softened, but her tone was steady. Then you show him what they tried to bury. Hours later, Jamal sat on a video call with Dr. Brooks, his notebook open beside him like a shield. The professor's face appeared on the screen, a middle-aged black man with sharp eyes and a kind smile. For the first few minutes, he didn't ask questions. He just watched Jamal, measuring him, as though trying to reconcile the equations with the teenager in front of him. Tell me, Brooks finally said, his voice low and even. How long have you been working on this? Jamal swallowed, his voice shaky. A few months. I started with a pattern I saw in probability models. It didn't make sense the way it was taught, so I tried to write it differently. Then the pieces just started connecting. Brooks leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in awe. Do you realize what you've written? This isn't just clever algebra. This could change how we predict outcomes in complex systems, logistics, climate models, even economics. If refined, it's the kind of thing people build careers around. Jamal blinked. So, it's real? It's not noise? The professor's voice sharpened, almost angry. Noise? Who told you that? Jamal hesitated, then muttered, my teacher. He said it was just noise. Brooks exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Of course he did. His voice softened again. Listen to me, Jamal. What you've done here is the opposite of noise. It's clarity. And the fact that they couldn't see it, that says more about them than it ever will about you. For the first time since he had picked up that piece of chalk, Jamal felt something crack open inside him. Recognition. Not from his classmates, not from Whitmore or Raymond, but from someone who mattered, someone whose world revolved around equations and theories, and who still saw him. Would you be willing to let me mentor you? Brooks asked. I can't promise the road will be easy. People will resist this, especially once they know it came from you. But I can promise you won't have to walk it alone. Jamal nodded quickly, his throat too tight to speak. Denise, standing just out of frame, pressed her hand to her chest, tears threatening her eyes. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in the room. Over the next days, Brooks sent him resources, papers, problems, even video lectures. He treated Jamal not like a student to be humored, but like a peer. Jamal devoured everything, scribbling in his notebook until his hands cramped, staying up past midnight not out of desperation but exhilaration. But as his world expanded through those late-night sessions, the walls of Lincoln High closed in tighter. Because while Brooks lifted him up, the school and now the local community was dragging him down. On Friday morning, just as Jamal was preparing for another call with Brooks, a knock rattled the front door. Denise wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer, expecting a neighbor. Instead, 2 news reporters stood there, microphones in hand, cameras already rolling. Mrs. Carter, one asked, smiling too brightly. We'd like to ask a few questions about your son. Denise froze, caught between pride and fear. About what? The reporter tilted her head, eyes gleaming with practiced curiosity. About the controversy. The school says he's been suspended for plagiarism, yet online people are calling him a prodigy. Which is it? Before Denise could respond, Jamal appeared in the hallway, his stomach dropping at the sight. Mr. Carter, the second reporter said, spotting him. Can we get a comment? Did you steal those equations, or are you really the genius people online claim? The camera light snapped on, blinding in its intensity. Jamal stood frozen, his heart pounding. But the reporter wasn't finished. She raised a manila folder in her hand, flipping it open just enough for Jamal to see what was inside. His school record. According to documents we obtained, she said smoothly, you've had disciplinary notes in the past. Minor, yes, but they raise questions. Should the public believe someone with a troubled school record is capable of rewriting mathematics? Denise's voice rose behind him, sharp and protective. That's enough. You get off my porch right now. The reporters didn't budge. The public deserves answers, one insisted, angling the microphone closer to Jamal's face. Are you a fraud hiding behind a fake name? Or is this just another case of a school inflating controversy to cover its own failures? Jamal's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his throat locked up. He could already imagine how his words would be twisted, replayed, dissected. The camera lens focused on him, recording every flicker of doubt in his eyes. News reporters arrive at Jamal's doorstep, but instead of celebrating him, they focus on his troubled school record. The knock on the door had only been the beginning. By the weekend, Jamal's name, or rather the scandal surrounding it, was everywhere. Local news stations ran with the footage of him frozen on his porch, the camera catching every flicker of unease in his eyes. Reporters who hadn't bothered to show up when he won a science fair ribbon in middle school were now eager to frame him as either a fraud or a curiosity. The first headline hit hard. Troubled teen claims genius. Is J.A. Miles a fraud? It wasn't about the math, not about the originality of his equations, or the implications Dr. Brooks had seen in them. No, the narrative was about him, about the boy from Lincoln Heights, who, according to leaked records, had been written up twice for disruptive behavior in school. One note was for talking back when a substitute had mistaken him for a student in the wrong class. Another for refusing to hand over his notebook when Whitmore had accused him of cheating last year. Minor incidents, blown into headlines that painted him as reckless, unreliable, dishonest. On TV, pundits dissected his story, as though he were a case study, instead of a 17-year-old. One panel argued that his supposed brilliance was a fantasy built to distract from his problematic background. Another claimed the journal had been duped by a clever forgery. Rarely did anyone mention the equations themselves. Denise sat on the couch at night, the television flickering across her worried face. She tried to switch the channels when Jamal entered the room, but he always caught enough to know they weren't celebrating him. They were circling like vultures. This isn't about math anymore, Denise muttered one evening, clicking the TV off with more force than necessary. They don't care what you wrote. They care about making a story out of you. And baby, they'll tear you down to sell it. Jamal leaned against the doorway, his fists buried in his hoodie pocket. I shouldn't have written it. I should have just kept it to myself. Don't you dare say that. Denise snapped, turning to him with fire in her eyes. That's what they want you to think. They want you to regret being smart, being different. But Jamal, listen to me. They're not scared because it's wrong. They're scared because it's right, and because it came from you. Her words stayed with him, even as the noise outside grew louder. By midweek, the story had spread beyond local outlets. A national paper ran a piece titled, Prodigy or Pretender? The Mystery of J.A. Miles. The article used words that stung: unproven, suspicious, unlikely. It included photos of Lincoln Heights, framing his neighborhood as though it were evidence against him. Shots of cracked sidewalks and corner stores with flickering neon signs were captioned with lines like, Carter's environment hardly suggests the makings of a mathematical revolutionary. It wasn't just him they were undermining, it was everyone like him. His mother, his neighbors, his whole community, reduced to a backdrop for their doubts. Even Dr. Brooks called one evening, his voice tight with anger. They're twisting at Jamal. They're afraid to let the work stand on its own, so they're dragging you through the mud. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. But Jamal was already breaking. Every time he opened his phone, he saw strangers debating his worth. Some claimed he was a genius, others swore he was a fraud, but nearly all of them spoke as though he wasn't even human, as though he was just a headline. Then came the televised debate. A local station promoted it all week. The J.A. Miles controversy, fraud or prodigy. The panel featured 2 university professors, a journalist who had written the damning article, and most gutting of all, Mr. Whitmore. Denise begged Jamal not to watch. "Baby, it'll only hurt you. Don't let his voice in your head again." Jamal nodded silently, retreating into his room. He didn't need to see Whitmore's face on TV to know what he'd say. He could hear the mocking tone already, the chuckle, the dismissal, the certainty that someone like Jamal couldn't possibly have written something so advanced. Instead of turning on the television, Jamal opened his notebook. The equations stared back at him, unfinished, waiting. He set his pencil to the page, his hand trembling at first, then steadier with each line, while Whitmore's voice spilled venom into living rooms across the city. Jamal chased the missing piece of his theory. In the debate, Whitmore leaned into the camera, declaring, "I know this boy. I've taught him. There is no world in which Jamal Carter produced those equations on his own. He's bright, but not brilliant. What you're seeing is either a hoax or a theft, and the school was right to suspend him." The journalist nodded gravely. "So you're saying this is more than unlikely? It's impossible." Whitmore smirked. "Exactly. And the sooner we stop entertaining this fantasy, the better." Across the city, families shook their heads at the television. Some believed him. Others felt the sting of his certainty. And in Jamal's room, the pencil scratched against paper, defying every word. Denise stood outside his door, torn between the urge to protect him from the storm and the recognition that this storm was forging him into something stronger. She listened to the soft murmur of his pencil, the rhythm of resistance. Jamal didn't hear the debate. He didn't need to. All he knew was that the math called to him louder than the world's noise. And as he scribbled furiously into the night, he felt it, that flicker of discovery. The missing piece wasn't far. A televised debate features Jamal's teacher declaring him a fraud. But Jamal isn't watching. He's working on the missing piece of his theory. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the scratching of Jamal's pencil. His room was dim, lit only by the glow of a desk lamp that leaned precariously over pages covered in symbols, arrows, and numbers. Hours had passed since the televised debate, but Jamal hadn't watched a second of it. He didn't need to hear Whitmore declare him a fraud. He already knew the teacher's voice by heart. Instead, he drowned it out with math. For days, he had chased a single missing piece, the flaw that left his theory incomplete. He felt it in his bones. If he could just close that gap, the whole structure would stand, undeniable. But the more he searched, the more elusive it became, slipping from him like mist. The clock ticked past midnight. His eyes burned from fatigue, his fingers smudged with graphite. Denise had long since gone to bed, though Jamal knew she wouldn't really sleep. Not with reporters circling, not with the weight of the world pressing against their thin walls. Jamal sat back, rubbing his temples. Doubt crept in, whispering in Whitmore's voice. Noise, nothing but noise. He clenched his fists, forcing the thought away. Then he saw it, so small it almost escaped him. A line he had dismissed earlier, a variable he had treated as constant. His eyes widened, his heart skipped. He leaned forward, erasing furiously, rewriting the sequence with trembling hands. Line by line, the equations began to shift, as though they had been waiting all along for him to notice. Patterns emerged, clear and sharp, where before there had been static. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. "This is it," he whispered to himself, the words breaking the silence like a prayer. The pencil flew across the page, his hand aching as he worked, rewriting entire sections. Every few minutes he paused, staring at the connections forming before him, then pressed on, unstoppable. It felt less like creating and more like uncovering something that had always been there, buried just beneath the surface. By the time the clock struck 3, his desk was covered in papers, each one a fragment of the whole. And at the center, on the newest sheet, the final equation gleamed back at him, balanced, complete, alive. Jamal sat frozen, staring at it. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For weeks he had carried the weight of being mocked, doubted, dismissed. For days he had been branded a liar, a fraud. And yet here it was, proof that he had been right all along. A laugh escaped him, low and shaky, turning into something closer to a sob. He pressed his hand to his mouth, overwhelmed. For a moment, the noise of the world faded, and there was only this: a 17-year-old boy from Lincoln Heights holding a key to something larger than himself. When he finally gathered the pages, arranging them into order, his hands trembled with reverence. He opened his laptop, typing until the file mirrored the neatness of his handwritten work. He formatted it carefully, every detail precise. This wasn't just survival anymore, it was history. He hit print. The machine in the corner of the room whirred to life, spitting out sheets of paper one by one. Jamal watched them pile up, the sound steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. But then cutting through that rhythm came another sound. A wail in the distance rising, approaching. Sirens. Jamal froze, his body rigid. The flashing lights appeared outside his window, red and blue washing over the room in violent bursts. The sound grew louder until it filled the street, until it filled his chest. He stumbled to the window, pulling back the curtain with shaking hands. 2 squad cars screeched to a stop in front of the house. Doors slammed. Heavy boots hit pavement. Voices shouted commands he couldn't make out. His heart pounded.
No, no, no.
Denise's door creaked open behind him. Jamal? Her voice was groggy, confused, then sharp with alarm as she saw the lights. What's happening? Before he could answer, fists pounded against the front door. Open up, police. Jamal's stomach dropped. What did I didn't. A voice boomed through the door. We have reason to believe there's illegal activity on this property related to computer hacking. Open the door now. Denise's face went pale. Computer hacking? Jamal, what did you do?
I didn't do anything.
His voice cracked with panic. Then his mind raced back to the late nights he had logged into academic servers, slipping past paywalls to read papers he couldn't otherwise access. He hadn't thought of it as hacking. He had thought of it as survival, as the only way to learn what he needed to refine his theory. But now the sirens outside said otherwise. The printer kept spitting pages indifferent, each sheet carrying the proof of his breakthrough, even as the world outside moved to tear it away. The pounding on the door grew louder. Denise grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with terror. Stay here. Don't you move. But Jamal knew staying wouldn't save him. The walls were closing in again, louder and harsher than ever before. And for the first time, he realized the very knowledge that had freed him might now be the chain used to drag him down. As Jamal prints his final draft, police sirens flash outside. He's being accused of computer hacking after logging into academic servers for research. The pounding on the door rattled the thin wood as Denise pulled Jamal back from the window. Her voice trembled. Don't move. Don't say a word. But the command outside thundered again. Police. Open the door now. Denise took a deep breath and swung it open. Flashlights blinded her, and within seconds, officers in dark uniforms flooded the living room. Their boots tracked dirt across the carpet. Their voices sharp, rehearsed, merciless. We have a warrant, one barked, holding up a slip of paper no one had time to read. Another officer shoved past, heading straight toward Jamal's room. Jamal stumbled forward, his voice breaking. Wait, what are you doing? What did I do? A tall officer grabbed him by the arm, yanking it behind his back. The cold snap of handcuffs bit into his wrists. You're under investigation for computer intrusion and academic theft, the officer said flatly. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Jamal's chest seized. I didn't steal anything. I was just reading. Quiet, the officer snapped, pushing him forward. Denise lunged forward, her voice fierce. He's 17. He hasn't stolen a thing. That's his work, you hear me? His. Another officer blocked her path, lowering his voice with patronizing calm. Ma'am, if you want to help your son, stand back. But Denise didn't stand back. She stood shaking, helpless, watching as they dragged her boy who had done nothing but write numbers through the living room like a criminal. The printer still hummed in the background, spitting out the last pages of Jamal's breakthrough, as though mocking the scene unfolding. One officer snatched the stack from the tray, flipping through the dense equations before tucking it into an evidence bag. Another swept Jamal's notebooks off his desk, pages filled with weeks of his soul, and shoved them into boxes labeled property of state police. They're just notebooks, Denise screamed. That's his mind you're stealing. Neighbors spilled onto their porches as Jamal was marched outside. The flashing red and blue lights painted the block in chaos. illuminating every staring face. Phones came out, recording, capturing every second. The boy in handcuffs, the mother begging, the police expressionless. Jamal's face burned, not from guilt, but from shame he didn't deserve. He wanted to shout the truth, that his only crime was wanting knowledge locked behind paywalls, knowledge people with money accessed freely. But with the cuffs cutting into his wrists, the truth felt powerless. The videos hit the internet before the squad car even pulled away. By morning, hashtags trended, math fraud and free Jamal. Clips circulated on TikTok and Twitter, some captioned with outrage, others dripping with mockery. One video showed Denise yelling, "That's his mind you're stealing," replayed millions of times, sometimes with laughing emojis, sometimes with fists raised in solidarity. Cable news split into factions. One anchor shook her head gravely. A so-called math prodigy caught hacking academic servers. Is this genius or deception? Another countered, he's a child criminalized for being brilliant. This is what systemic racism looks like. By the time Jamal sat in the holding cell, his name had become a national debate. The cell was small, painted the dull gray of indifference. A thin bench lined the wall, where Jamal sat hunched, his hands still cuffed in front of him. His notebooks were gone, his laptop gone, his freedom gone, the weight of it pressed down harder than the metal biting his wrists. Across the hallway, officers lingered near the desk, their voices carrying into the cell. "You see the stuff they pulled from his room?" One chuckled. "Looks like gibberish to me, bunch of numbers and squiggly lines." The others laughed. "Yeah, he thinks he's Einstein. More like some punk who got too curious with the wrong computer." Jamal closed his eyes, the humiliation sinking deeper. He had dreamed of being in rooms with mathematicians debating his work. Instead, here he was, mocked by officers who didn't know a theorem from a doodle. Then one voice broke through, quieter but distinct. "I looked it up." The laughter paused. "Looked what up?" "The equations. Or whatever he calls them. They're online. Some professors are talking about it, and they're not laughing. One even said it could change how prediction models work." Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. Then another officer scoffed. Louder. "Yeah, right. You think some kid from Lincoln Heights is rewriting math? Be serious." But Jamal's heart skipped. Someone had said it out loud. Someone in uniform, in this very station, had admitted his work might be real. His head snapped up, hope flickering for the first time since the cuffs clicked shut. Because if even one of them believed enough to look it up, then maybe, just maybe, the truth couldn't be buried. In the holding cell, Jamal overhears officers mocking his theory, until one officer admits he looked it up, and it might actually be real. The clang of the cell door still echoed in Jamal's ears when the trial date was set. It didn't take long. His arrest had become too public, too controversial. The state moved quickly, and the courtroom filled even faster with reporters, with spectators, with voices eager to turn his life into spectacle. For Jamal, the courtroom felt like a stage he had never wanted to step onto. The air smelled of wood polish and paper, the high ceilings intimidating, the mahogany benches crowded with strangers. Cameras were barred from entering, but journalists lined the steps outside, broadcasting every update. His case wasn't just about computer intrusion anymore. It was about whether a black teenager from Lincoln Heights could possibly be the mind behind equations professors themselves struggled to decode. Denise sat at the defense table beside him, her hand gripping his. She wore her best church dress, though the strain on her face betrayed sleepless nights. Jamal's public defender, a young man named Ruiz, who looked barely older than a graduate student, shuffled nervously through papers. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who won landmark cases. But he was all they had. Across the aisle, the prosecution sat tall and confident, their laptops gleaming. To them, this case wasn't about truth. It was about sending a message. The judge called the room to order, his gavel cracking like thunder. State versus Jamal Carter. From the start, the prosecution painted him not as a student but as a schemer. They projected screenshots of academic servers, showing the login attempts tied to Jamal's laptop. They showed clips of the arrest, edited to make Denise's cries sound hysterical, and photos of Jamal's equations splashed across the board in Whitmore's classroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor declared, pacing before the jury, "what we have here is not a genius. What we have is a young man who learned how to copy brilliance and disguise it as his own. An imposter. A fraud. He accessed restricted academic networks illegally, and now he seeks to pass off stolen work as original. Do not be fooled." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Jamal sat still, his heart pounding. He wanted to scream that he hadn't stolen a thing, that those numbers were born in his own restless nights. But in this room, every word would be twisted.
Then it was Ruiz's turn.
He stood shakily, adjusting his glasses, but when he spoke, his voice found a steadiness Jamal hadn't expected. "This is not the trial of a hacker," Ruiz said firmly. "This is the trial of a boy whose only crime was wanting to learn. Jamal Carter is not a thief. He is a thinker. Those equations the prosecution calls stolen, they are his. We will prove that, and when we do, you will see this case for what it is. Not about fraud, but about fear. Fear that genius could come from someone the world did not expect." Denise squeezed Jamal's hand under the table. For the first time, he saw a flicker of fire in Ruiz's eyes. The trial stretched over days. Experts were called, one after another, flown in from universities across the country. The prosecution brought their voices first. Professors from prestigious schools testified that the work was highly unlikely to be original. One declared, "I've spent my life studying mathematics, and I would struggle to assemble this framework in a matter of months. Are we to believe a teenager did it between homework assignments?" Laughter scattered through the gallery. Jamal lowered his head. But Ruiz countered with witnesses of his own. And here came the twist no one had expected. Dr. Elijah Brooks took the stand. His presence filled the room with quiet authority. A black professor from MIT, his reputation preceded him. And for once Jamal saw reporters scribbling with interest instead of ridicule. "Dr. Brooks," Ruiz began, "you've reviewed the work attributed to J.A. Miles." Brooks nodded. "I have. Extensively. In your conclusion." Brooks leaned forward, his voice carrying conviction. "It is not stolen. It is not copied. It is the product of original thought. And remarkable thought at that. I've mentored doctoral students who could not see the patterns this young man has seen." The prosecution rose sharply. "Are you seriously suggesting a high school student surpassed graduate-level research?" Brooks didn't flinch. "I am not suggesting. I am stating. The equations hold truths our field has not yet reached. And the fact that they came from a 17-year-old in Lincoln Heights does not make them less true. It makes them more extraordinary." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jamal's chest tightened, gratitude and disbelief colliding inside him. For the first time, someone was saying aloud what he had only dared whisper to himself. The days that followed turned the trial into something stranger than theater. It became a classroom. Jurors scribbled notes, as experts debated the math itself. Diagrams were drawn on boards, papers shuffled and projected. One by one, scholars weighed in. Not just on legality, but on possibility. Could this really come from him? Could genius really wear the face of Jamal Carter? Outside the courthouse, protests swelled. Some carried signs reading "Free Jamal," while others waved posters calling him a fraud. The nation was split. The case no longer about math, but about identity, race, and who had the right to genius. By the final week, the jury sat weary but alert, caught between two worlds, one insisting Jamal was a thief, the other declaring him a prodigy. Ruiz made his closing argument simple. Every page they seized, every note they mocked. He wrote those alone. If Jamal Carter were born in a different body, in a different zip code, we wouldn't be here today. You'd be calling him the next Einstein. But because he was born here, to her in this skin, suddenly genius looks like fraud. That's not justice. That's prejudice. Denise wept silently as Ruiz sat down. Jamal stared at the table, afraid to believe, afraid to hope. The jury filed out to deliberate. Hours passed. The tension in the courtroom coiled tighter with every tick of the clock. Jamal sat with his hands folded, whispering silent prayers, waiting for the verdict that could decide his future. Then, just as the bailiff moved to call the jury back in, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Every head turned. Reporters leaned forward. The judge frowned. And there, stepping into the silence, was a figure no one had expected. A world-renowned scientist, one of the most respected names in mathematics. "I need to be heard," the man declared, his voice ringing through the chamber. "What I have to say changes everything." Right as the jury prepares its decision, a world-renowned scientist interrupts with shocking news. The courtroom had been tense before, but when the tall, silver-haired man strode through the doors, the air shifted into something heavier, like gravity itself had increased. Even the judge, who had maintained an air of authority throughout, leaned forward with recognition. The murmurs from the gallery grew into a low roar. It was Dr. Nathaniel Avery, a household name in mathematics. Avery had authored textbooks used in classrooms worldwide. He had stood on stages in Europe, Asia, and America, hailed as one of the greatest minds of the century. If Brooks was respected, Avery was untouchable, his reputation the gold standard of credibility. "I apologize for the disruption," Avery said, his voice calm but carrying authority that silenced the room. "But I could not remain silent, knowing what is at stake here." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Dr. Avery, this is highly irregular. The jury is already in deliberation." "With respect, Your Honor," Avery interrupted gently but firmly, "if they deliberate without hearing what I've brought, they will deliberate on a falsehood." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection. This is—" "Sit down," the judge said sharply, more rattled than he intended. "Proceed, Dr. Avery. But make it brief." Avery stepped to the witness stand, the bailiff swearing him in. His eyes scanned the courtroom before settling on Jamal, who sat frozen, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "I have reviewed the equations attributed to J.A. Miles," Avery began. "I did not believe they could come from a teenager. I admit that freely. But I also did not dismiss them. I had my research team at Cambridge run simulations based on Carter's framework. The results were undeniable." Gasps rippled through the room. Even Ruiz blinked in surprise. Avery continued, his voice steady. "The theory has predictive accuracy we've never achieved before. Models that once produced 70% confidence now hit above in logistics, in weather patterns, in financial forecasting. Applications that would take years of trial and error suddenly produced results in hours. This is not theory anymore. It is application. An application of this caliber cannot be plagiarized. If it had existed before, we would already be using it." Denise pressed her hands to her face, tears spilling silently. Jamal sat stunned, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He had dreamed of someone recognizing his work, but never like this. Not in a courtroom, not with the world watching. The prosecutor scrambled to recover. "Dr. Avery, surely you understand, this work could not have been produced by a high school student. Isn't it possible Carter copied an unpublished draft that he stole from a researcher before it was released?" Avery fixed the prosecutor with a look that silenced him more effectively than any gavel. "No unpublished draft exists. I would know. I've been at the forefront of this field for decades. This," he lifted a copy of Jamal's equations from the evidence table, "is new. It is revolutionary, and it belongs to him." The gallery erupted in murmurs, some gasping, some clapping before the judge's gavel restored order. Cameras outside caught wind of the testimony instantly, pushing the story nationwide within minutes. For Jamal, the weight of Avery's words was both liberation and burden. Liberation because finally, the genius in his notebook had been acknowledged by the most respected voice in the field. Burden because now there was no hiding. He was no longer anonymous. He was no longer just a boy in suspension. He was the center of a storm too large to escape. The jury's deliberation was halted. The judge ordered that the testimony be entered into record, and the court recessed for the day to consider next steps. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting Jamal's name, shoving microphones toward him and Denise. Cameras flashed like lightning. "Do you feel vindicated?" one shouted. "Did you really write those equations yourself?" another pressed. "Is this the beginning of a new Einstein, or the greatest academic fraud in history?" Denise shielded Jamal as best she could, ushering him into the car. Ruiz fought the crowd with his briefcase, shouting for space. Inside, Jamal sat trembling, his mind spinning. Dr. Brooks called that evening, his voice warm with pride. "Do you see now? Even Avery, the man I studied under, says what I've been telling you all along. You're not noise, Jamal. You're signal, the clearest signal we've had in years." But Jamal could barely process the encouragement. His mind was already bracing for the backlash. For every person who now called him a prodigy, another would dig harder to call him a fraud. And if Avery's words had lit the match of recognition, they had also poured gasoline on the fire of scrutiny. The following morning, Ruiz received notice from the prosecution. They intended to call a new witness. When Ruiz shared the name, Denise's face went pale with fury. "They wouldn't. They would," Ruiz said grimly. "And the judge has allowed it." Jamal's stomach dropped as the name echoed in his ears. Mr. Whitmore. The man who had laughed at him in class. The man who had called his work noise. The man whose smirk still haunted him every time he picked up a pencil. The prosecution's plan was clear. If Avery had elevated Jamal in the eyes of the court, Whitmore would try to drag him back down. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The courtroom filled to capacity, reporters elbowing for seats, the public cramming the gallery. The judge called for order. The prosecution may call their next witness. Your Honor, the prosecutor said smoothly, we call Mr. Richard Whitmore. The bailiff opened the side door, and Whitmore entered, his suit pressed, his expression self-satisfied. He moved toward the stand, adjusting his tie, his eyes flicking toward Jamal with the faintest curl of a smirk. Denise gripped Jamal's hand tightly. He sat frozen, his throat dry, as the man who had mocked him in front of the class prepared to do it again. But this time, under oath. The courtroom gasps, as Jamal's schoolteacher is called to testify, under oath, about why he mocked and silenced the student in the first place. Whitmore adjusted his tie as he settled into the witness stand, his posture stiff with the self-importance of a man who believed the room was on his side. The courtroom fell quiet, the tension so sharp it felt like the air itself might splinter. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready, as the man who had first mocked Jamal's equations prepared to do it again, only this time with the weight of the law behind him. The prosecutor stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, how long have you been teaching mathematics at Lincoln High? 23 years, Whitmore replied, his voice carrying smug pride. I've seen my share of promising students, and frankly plenty of misguided ones. His eyes flicked toward Jamal, the faint smirk curling at his lips. And in your professional opinion, the prosecutor pressed, did Jamal Carter ever demonstrate the capability to produce the equations in question? Whitmore chuckled, shaking his head. Capability? No. Ambition, perhaps. But ambition without foundation is just chaos. Jamal was bright, sure, but he often overreached, drawing connections where none existed. The so-called theory he scrawled on my board was nothing more than noise. I told him as much in front of the class, and I stand by that today. The words landed like punches, each one echoing in Jamal's ears. Denise's grip on his hand tightened, her nails pressing into his skin, as if grounding him against the humiliation. Noise, Whitmore repeated, louder this time, as if he relished the sting. What you see here is not genius. It's delusion, a desire to be more than he is. And I say that not with malice, but with professional honesty. A murmur spread through the gallery, the kind of murmur that carried doubt, pity, and judgment. Ruiz stood quickly. Objection. Speculative and inflammatory. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Sustained. Mr. Whitmore, stick to the facts. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Ruiz rose for cross-examination, his face calm but his eyes sharp. Mr. Whitmore, you've been teaching for over 2 decades, correct? Correct. And in that time, how many students have produced original mathematical work worth publishing? Whitmore smirked. None. High school students don't produce work of that caliber. So it's not that Jamal couldn't have done it, Ruiz pressed, stepping closer. It's that you couldn't imagine any student doing it. Isn't that right? Whitmore shifted in his seat. That's not what I said. But isn't it true, Ruiz continued, his voice steady, that when Jamal attempted to show his work in your classroom, you not only dismissed it, you mocked him. You led the class in laughter at his expense? The smirk faltered. I wouldn't call it laughter. More correction. Correction? Ruiz raised an eyebrow. Is that what you call it when you strip a student of dignity in front of his peers? The gallery murmured again, louder this time. Whitmore's face reddened. And tell me, Mr. Whitmore, Ruiz added, his tone sharpening, did you consider for a moment that your dismissal might have less to do with the math and more to do with the student? Objection, the prosecutor barked. Counsel is insinuating. But Ruiz was already moving toward the evidence table. He picked up a folder and flipped it open with a snap. Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to enter new evidence into the record, emails obtained from Lincoln High's servers under subpoena. The prosecutor's face blanched. What? The judge gestured. Proceed. Ruiz handed the papers to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The judge skimmed, his expression darkening. Admissible. Ruiz turned back to Whitmore, his voice ice. Mr. Whitmore, are these your emails? Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. Yes, but I don't. Ruiz read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. Subject, Carter again. Body. Kid's delusions are exhausting. Thinks he's rewriting math instead of learning it. Another wannabe genius from the wrong side of town. He'll never amount to anything but trouble. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Denise's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling. Jamal sat frozen, his stomach twisting. Ruiz lifted another page. Subject: waste of time. Body: if I have to hear about Carter's theories one more time, I might lose it. He's chasing fantasies, and the administration needs to shut him down before he embarrasses us all. The room erupted. Murmurs, whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. The judge banged the gavel for order. Ruiz's voice sharpened. So it wasn't just in the classroom. It wasn't just an offhand comment. You deliberately targeted Jamal Carter, mocked him to colleagues, and urged the administration to silence him, all because you refused to believe a black student from Lincoln Heights could be more than your stereotype. Whitmore's face drained of color. Those were private frustrations, not professional assessments. Private frustrations. Ruiz's eyes blazed. Private frustrations that became public humiliation for a 17-year-old. Private frustrations that conveniently aligned with suspending him the moment his work gained recognition. Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, was it frustration or was it fear? Whitmore stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. The gallery leaned forward, the tide turning. The judge's gavel cracked again. Order. But the damage was irreversible. Whitmore's mask had cracked wide open. By the afternoon, the jury had heard enough. The emails painted a picture not of a teacher upholding standards, but of a man weaponizing authority to bury a student he couldn't imagine as brilliant. When the verdict was read, the room held its breath. Not guilty. The words rang like a bell, sharp and liberating. Denise sobbed, clutching Jamal's hand with both of hers. Ruiz exhaled shakily, relief washing over him. The gallery erupted, half with cheers, half with stunned silence. Jamal, though, didn't move. He sat still, the words settling heavy on his shoulders. Not guilty. Acquitted. Free. And yet he didn't feel free. As they walked out of the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, strangers cheered. But Jamal's face stayed solemn, because he knew the truth. He had won his case, but not his dignity. He wasn't walking out lighter, he was walking out carrying something heavier than freedom. The knowledge of how easily his brilliance could have been erased. Jamal is acquitted, but he walks out silently, carrying something heavier than freedom. The verdict echoed long after Jamal left the courthouse. Not guilty. The phrase played in headlines, in TV broadcasts, in conversations across the country. But in Jamal's chest, it didn't ring like victory. It felt like a reprieve, a pause between battles. For days, he stayed quiet, avoiding the chaos outside. Denise answered the flood of calls from reporters and universities, deflecting as best she could. He's resting, she would say, her voice protective, weary. But Jamal wasn't resting. He was right. The theory, now complete, called to him with relentless urgency. Then one morning, a letter arrived. This time without controversy, without accusation. It bore the seal of the International Mathematics Conference. Inside was a formal invitation. Jamal Carter, recognized for his pioneering work, was asked to present his theory to an audience of the world's greatest scholars in Geneva, Switzerland. Denise read it twice before handing it to him, her hands trembling.
Baby, this is it.
This is what they can't take from you. Jamal stared at the page, the words both thrilling and terrifying. An international stage, a place where every doubt, every humiliation, every whispered slur would collide with truth, and he would have no chalkboard to erase, no corner to hide in. He would stand exposed. Dr. Brooks called that evening, his voice brimming with pride. This is the door, Jamal. The one you thought was locked. Now it's wide open. Walk through it. The weeks that followed blurred into preparation. Passport forms, travel arrangements, Brooks guiding him through rehearsals, over video calls. Denise fussed over his clothes, insisting he look the part. You're not just my boy on that stage, she said, her voice thick. You're every boy they ever doubted. You show them. And then Geneva. The city glittered against the backdrop of snow-tipped mountains. The conference hall a cathedral of glass and steel. Inside, banners stretched across walls, bearing the names of institutions Jamal had once only dreamed of. Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, MIT, scholars in pressed suits and tailored dresses filled the lobby, their conversations a low hum of brilliance. Jamal walked through it all, feeling both invisible and exposed. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with skepticism. He could read it in their eyes. That boy, the one from the trial. But he also saw another gaze, one he hadn't known before. Respect. A handful of scholars nodded as he passed, some even offering quiet smiles. The tide was turning, even if unevenly. Backstage he paced, his heart pounding against his ribs. Brooks placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me," the professor said, his voice firm. "This isn't about proving them wrong. This is about showing the truth. The work will speak louder than their prejudice ever could." Denise, seated near the front row, caught his eye. She mouthed the words she had told him since the day he picked up chalk. "Don't let them erase you." The announcer's voice boomed. "Presenting next, Jamal Carter, Lincoln High School, United States." The name echoed like a challenge. Jamal stepped toward the stage, the lights hot on his skin, the murmur of the crowd swelling into silence. He clutched his notes, his palms slick. Every humiliation, the laughter in the classroom, the suspension notice, the handcuffs, all of it followed him to this moment. As he reached the podium, he paused, scanning the sea of faces. Rows upon rows of scholars, some leaning forward, others crossing arms skeptically. He drew a shaky breath, and then he saw it. In the middle of the crowd, seated stiffly among the rows of academics, was a face he knew too well. The neatly pressed suit couldn't disguise him. The polished glasses couldn't erase the memory. "Mr. Whitmore." Jamal's chest tightened. For a moment, the stage blurred, the lights too bright, the silence deafening. He had expected scholars to doubt him. He had braced for reporters, for strangers. But not the man who had called his brilliance noise, who had led his class in laughter, who had nearly destroyed him. Whitmore's face was pale, his posture rigid. He didn't smirk this time. He didn't laugh. He simply sat, his eyes locked on the boy he had tried to bury. Jamal's hands trembled on the podium. The speech he had rehearsed, the confidence Brooks had tried to instill, all threatened to scatter. This wasn't just a presentation anymore. It was a reckoning. Just as Jamal steps onto the stage, he sees a familiar face in the audience. His former teacher, seated in shame. Jamal gripped the podium, his knuckles pale against the wood. The conference hall stretched before him like an ocean of eyes and expectation. His heart hammered, not just from the enormity of the stage, but from the face seated halfway down the audience, Whitmore. For a moment, time threatened to collapse. He wasn't in Geneva anymore. He was back in room 214, chalk dust clinging to his fingers, laughter ringing in his ears. He saw Whitmore's smirk, heard the word noise, felt the weight of erasing his own brilliance from the board. But then Denise's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't let them erase you." He drew in a slow breath, lifted his notes, and began. His voice wavered on the first sentence, but steadied as the rhythm of the math carried him. He explained the framework, breaking down his equations into clear, layered steps. Screens behind him lit up with visuals he had prepared, models showing how his formula didn't just exist. It worked. Predictions aligned, outcomes matched, variables fell into place with astonishing accuracy. The room grew still, scholars leaning forward, pens forgotten in their hands. "This," Jamal said, pointing to a chart behind him, "is not just a theory, it's a tool, where older models predicted with 70% confidence. This raises the bar to 95. In applied mathematics, that's not just improvement, it's transformation." Whispers rippled through the hall. Brooks, seated in the front row, nodded proudly, his eyes never leaving Jamal. Denise, beside him, pressed her hands together in silent prayer, tears threatening her eyes. Jamal pressed on. He showed weather simulations that had run with uncanny precision, financial forecasts that predicted swings days ahead of real markets, logistics models that mapped supply chains with near-perfect accuracy. Each slide was more undeniable than the last. When he reached the conclusion, the silence was absolute. Hundreds of scholars sat in stillness, not from doubt, but from awe. Jamal set down his notes. "I know what it's like to have your work dismissed, to be told it's noise. But math doesn't care who writes it. Truth doesn't care where it comes from. And this truth is here now. The only question is whether we'll listen." The silence broke first with a single clap, then a wave of applause that grew until the entire hall stood. A standing ovation. The sound shook the walls, echoing against the steel and glass, reverberating through Jamal's chest. He stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed. For years, he had been invisible, laughed at, suspended, handcuffed. Now those same symbols had them on their feet. Yet even as the applause thundered, Jamal felt its weight, because he knew too well how close this had come to silence. If Leah hadn't snapped that photo, if Brooks hadn't believed, if Avery hadn't spoken, one teacher's laughter could have buried this forever. And in the middle of the ovation, Jamal's eyes found Whitmore. The teacher didn't clap. He sat rigid, his face pale, his gaze locked on the boy he once mocked. No smirk, no laughter, just silence. A silence that spoke louder than the ovation surrounding him. Jamal lifted his chin, his chest tight, but steady. This moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, reclaiming its voice. Afterward, the stage swarmed with scholars. Professors shook his hand, voices buzzing with excitement. Revolutionary, game-changing. We've been waiting for this. Business cards slipped into his pocket faster than he could keep track. Brooks approached, pride etched across his face. You didn't just present, Jamal. You taught them, and they listened. Denise threw her arms around him, tears streaming. You showed them, baby. You showed the whole world. But even amid the congratulations, Jamal's chest felt heavy. The ovation hadn't erased the arrest video. The headlines calling him a fraud, the courtroom where his dignity had been stripped. He was recognized now, but scarred, and he knew those scars would never leave him. Later that evening, as the conference wound down, the chair of the event, a tall man with a polished accent and decades in academia, pulled Jamal aside. His words were low, his tone deliberate. You should know, he said, what you presented today will change industries. Finance, weather, logistics, even national security. Entire systems will shift if your work is adopted. Jamal nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. The chair leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But that kind of power threatens people. There are those who profit from chaos, from uncertainty. They will not welcome what you've built, and some will not welcome you as the one who built it. A chill swept through Jamal. The applause still echoed in his memory, but this voice cut deeper. The chair's gaze held his. Be careful, young man. The world has heard you now, and some will do anything to silence you again. The conference chair whispers to Jamal that his work will change industries, but warns him about powerful forces that profit from keeping certain voices quiet. Lincoln High hadn't changed much. The same cracked bricks, the same faded banners clinging to the walls, the same halls that smelled faintly of floor polish and old textbooks. To Jamal it felt smaller now, like a stage he had outgrown but could never forget. He walked through the corridors slowly, Denise at his side, the echoes of his own footsteps mingling with memories that would not leave. Students peeked from classroom doors, whispering as they realized who he was. Not the fraud, not the troublemaker, but Jamal Carter, the boy whose name now appeared in international journals. The school board had invited him back officially, parading it as a celebration of student success. But Jamal wasn't there for their photo ops or their belated praise. He was there for himself and for the students still sitting in desks that once caged him. The classroom door to room 214 creaked open, and Jamal stepped inside. The air smelled the same, chalk dust and faint detergent. But the weight of it was different now. The room was full of students, gathered after the final bell at the school's request. Some were curious, some skeptical, others simply wide-eyed at the boy who had been headline news. And there it was. The board. The last time Jamal had stood at its front, his hand had shaken as Whitmore's laughter cut him down. He remembered the smirks, the whispers, the humiliation of erasing his own ideas as if they had been mistakes. Now the board stood clean, waiting. He took a piece of chalk, his hand trembled again, but not from fear, from memory, from the weight of how close this moment had come to never existing. Most of you know my name, Jamal said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room. But what you don't know is how it felt the last time I stood here. I wrote something I believed in, and it was erased, not just by me, but by laughter, by disbelief. He paused, looking at the faces staring back at him. I came back to finish what I started, not to prove anyone wrong, but to show you that even when the world calls you noise, you don't stop. You keep writing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned to the board and began. The chalk scratched against the surface, filling it line by line. His completed theory stretched across the green expanse, symbols, numbers, and arcs of thought flowing with clarity. Students leaned forward, their eyes tracking the rhythm of it. The silence deepened, not from dismissal this time, but from awe. When he reached the last line, Jamal stepped back. The board was alive again with his mind, but now no one laughed. The only sound was the faint hiss of chalk dust settling. From the back of the room, a hand lifted. Leah Turner. Her face was calmer now, older somehow, though only months had passed. She met his eyes and spoke softly. "I was the one who took the photo, the one that sent your work out of this room." Jamal blinked, the words landing with the weight of revelation. The moment he had thought lost forever, the equations erased under humiliation, had survived because she had believed when no one else did. Leah's voice wavered. "I didn't know what it meant. But I knew it wasn't noise. I knew it mattered." A hush fell over the room. Jamal nodded slowly, his chest tight. "Thank you," he said simply, because there were no other words big enough. Denise, standing near the door, wiped her eyes, her gaze never leaving her son. For a moment, the classroom felt like church, holy, heavy, alive with something larger than all of them. Jamal turned back to the board, staring at the equations, one last time. Then deliberately, he picked up the eraser. The students murmured, confused. Why erase what had just been written? "Because," Jamal said softly, "the board belongs to you now, not me. What matters isn't that these lines stay here forever. What matters is that you remember truth doesn't vanish when someone tries to erase it. It waits. It survives, just like you can." He pressed the eraser against the chalk, dragging it slowly across the board. The equations disappeared in white smudges, the green returning piece by piece. His movements were steady, solemn, like closing a chapter. When the board was empty again, Jamal set the eraser down, but faint traces of chalk still lingered, lines too stubborn to disappear completely, ghosts of brilliance that refused to die. He turned to the students. "One day, you'll stand where I'm standing, and when you do, don't let anyone tell you that your mind is noise." The room was silent, but the silence was thick with something unspoken. Respect, understanding, possibility. Jamal walked toward the door, Denise falling in step beside him. The students remained still, their eyes locked on the faint chalk lines left behind. As Jamal crossed the threshold, he glanced back one last time. The empty board shimmered faintly under the classroom lights, the ghost of his equations refusing to vanish entirely. And in that image, the truth lived. Brilliance cannot be erased. As Jamal erases the board and walks away, the camera lingers on the faint chalk lines, still visible, a reminder that truth cannot be erased. Jamal's story is a reminder of how easily voices can be silenced, and how powerful it is when truth finally breaks through. If you believe no child's brilliance should ever be erased because of who they are, type yes in the comments, and if this broke your heart, subscribe because these stories must be heard.